Ladies and gentlemen, heartily welcome to another NUPI seminar, both to you who are present here, but also to those of you watching the live stream on internet. My name is Per-Erik Solli. I'm a senior military advisor here at NUPI, and I will hopefully chair this seminar. Today's topic is maritime security in East Asia. It is an important and highly relevant matter. The current dispute between China and Vietnam is unfortunately just one of many episodes in recent times. Some of the challenges in the East Asian region are, first of all, overlapping maritime claims in international waters, and secondly, different views on international governance and maritime legal frameworks. But maritime security in East Asia is not only a regional challenge. International trade between Asia and other parts of the world depend on uninterrupted access to maritime shipping routes in East Asia. And also, unchecked escalation and armed conflict among states in East Asia can impact both the regional and also the global economy, and of course the Norwegian economy. Norway's Minister of Defense stated in a seminar on May the 12th that the Asia-Pacific is of strategic importance to Norway, and indeed developments in these parts of the world will have global effects. She also stated that what happens in Asia-Pacific affects us all. Norway is not a key player, nor do we aspire to play a larger role. However, there can be no doubt that there is a strategic interest of Norway to gain better insight into these developments in the Asia-Pacific. So this seminar is a small part of that. The plan for the seminar is that we have two distinguished international speakers, Professor Jeff Till from King's College in London, and also Dr. Sam Bateman from University of Wollongong in Australia. I do apologize if I got that pronunciation wrong. And we have a very knowledgeable Norwegian commentator, research professor, and also former director, Stein Tønneson from the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Now, without further ado, the first speaker today, Professor Jeff Till. He is formerly the Dean of Academic Studies at the Joint Services Command and Staff College, and is now Professor of Maritime Studies in the Defense Studies Department of King's. And he's also the director of the Corbett Center for Maritime Policy Studies. So, since 2009, Jeff Till has been a visiting professor at the Maritime Security Program of the Tam School of International Studies in Singapore. And his work has been translated into 9 languages. And he regularly speaks at staff colleges and academic conferences around the world. But today we are very glad that you are, for once, here in Oslo and at NUPI. And we are honored that you can speak at this seminar. Professor Till will cover the strategic and operational scene, including regional naval developments. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Right, as you can see, I've put on my title a reference to choosing battles, which ones to fight, because it seems to me that naval development in East Asia is both reflecting and changing the international context and the international environment. And outcomes and trajectories are going to be decided by the balance that's eventually struck between the two kinds of battles that I'm going to describe. So I'll come back to that theme right at the end. So what exactly are these two concepts? Well, the first is what I call the battle for maritime security, which is basically about maintaining good order at sea. Low intensity operations at the bottom end of the scale. The second is what I call battles for strategic dominance, the rather more familiar type of naval battle, which is all about securing strategic advantage. And what I'm going to do this afternoon, is to go quickly through both types as they seem to be developing in the Asia Pacific, looking at the ideas behind them, the consequent acquisitions and force structures that navies in that area are creating, and then finally levels of activity and operations. So let me start with the battle for maritime security, particularly concepts and aspirations. I think it all really starts with that. This is a map of the world produced by plotting radio transmissions from ships over a period of about a week. You see it picks out the big concentration of shipping activity in the Northern Hemisphere. It picks out some of the major sea routes. But what's significant is, with the exception of Australia, maybe New Zealand, if you've got an imagination, it doesn't pick out nations. This is a system that operates over and above the level of the nation state. It produces a kind of imperative for system-based roles for navies, which are fundamentally about defending the system. As far as East Asia is concerned, this translates out into something like this. This map picks out the key Asia-Pacific routes and its focus in places like the Straits of Malacca, around the bottom of India and across the Indian Ocean, and then through the South and East China Seas, a major area of interest for everything maritime in this particular region. Obviously, critical to the economy and the prosperity, indeed regime survival in China, Korea, Japan, because of the energy flows, the manufactured goods, and all the rest of it. The system, though, is challenged, always has been, always will be, by a whole series of things. Conflict between sea users. This might be between countries disputing common areas of sea, or it might be between different economic interests, like fishermen, oilmen, and tourists, for example, in the tourist industry. Maritime crime in its many forms, drug smuggling, piracy, people smuggling, all of those kinds of activities threatens stability at sea and from the sea, and therefore might challenge the system directly or indirectly. The degradation of resources, particularly fish stocks in this area, matters too, and that can be badly affected by environmental deterioration. These two things linked together can be regarded as another of the kind of challenges to the system. It may produce humanitarian disasters, tsunamis, typhoons, and that kind of thing, which can challenge the system too. And then there's involvement in the quarrels of others, by which I mean things like the Iran-Iraq war, tanker war in the Gulf, having an impact on international oil trade. And then finally, of course, deliberate attack. And it seems to me, really, that the function of navies, or a function of navies, is therefore to protect maritime security, to protect the system because of its importance to the world's peace and prosperity. As far as force structures is concerned, one of the things I think that's most obvious about looking at East Asia is the stress on Coast Guard agencies of one sort or another, which have been very rapidly and very extensively developed throughout the area, whose principal focus, of course, is on the protection of local waters against all manner of minor threats. Possibly gone furthest of all in China, where recently the whole system was reformed as part and parcel of the process of China becoming more maritime, a clear objective, if you like. But there's been significant advance and reform, and in many cases creation of Coast Guard forces around the region. It's also had a huge impact on the size and shape of local naval fleets as well. Having coastal waters that need to be defended, having the possibility of contributing to maritime security more widely, has also clearly affected what people buy and operate in terms of their local fleets. In Southeast Asia, for example, you can see modern corvettes being developed, offshore patrol vessels, the acquisition of helicopters, all of the sorts of things that seem to be associated, if you like, with the defense of local waters. This can be a question of doing slightly more than that, about maintaining national integrity in countries which are split up between different land areas, like, for example, the Philippines, Indonesia, even Malaysia, because national integrity has to be dependent to some extent on the security of the sea areas that divide bits of their countries. Of course, it's in many ways about sovereignty enforcement as well. The enforcement of sovereignty, about, if you like, exclusive concepts of maritime security, about keeping foreigners out of your waters and away from your resources, especially in cases where that sovereignty is in dispute. And clearly, the protection of economic resources, oil, gas, fish. What we've seen throughout East Asia is an increase in the relative importance of the economic part of national economic planning. In the 5 years programs of Vietnam and China, for example, over the last few years, there's been a considerable increase in the amount of attention paid to the maritime economy. And to some extent, it's also about forward defence, using your sea, if you like, as a kind of protective moat against the possibility of attack from others, whoever they might be. So let's look finally at the question of operations. As you might expect, I think this is a mix of collaborative and competitive naval operations, about naval operations in concert with the navies of other countries or coast guards of other countries, and to some extent a competitive series of operations as well. It's got a national focus, which is, as I've said, about protecting your offshore estate against the depredations of others, which tends to be exclusive. But there's a kind of regional, system-based approach to maritime security operations as well, which is much more inclusive rather than exclusive. It's about cooperating with others against common threats to the system. For some examples of this, you can't do better than the Straits of Malacca, a clearly important sea route whose safety and security is critical not just to local states but to the entire region. A great success story with a huge reduction in the extent to which piracy is a problem in that area. I would put this as an interesting example of collaboration too. The recent episode at the beginning of last year, which could in many ways have turned out to be very nasty, where there was a kind of invasion of part of Malaysia by some Philippine insurgents who claimed that area. On the one hand, it was indicative of the fact that they were able to do their invasion, several hundred armed people against wriggling through the sort of Malaysian defences, if you like. But on the other hand, the way that such a sensitive issue was so delicately handled by both the Philippines and Malaysia at the time and since indicates high levels of regional cooperation about defending stability, if you like, in that region. There's a away game part of this as well. Home game and an away game. And the away game is contributing to broader global acts in defence of maritime security. And here it's been interesting to see Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Korea, Australia, of course, participating in the counter-piracy operation of Somalia in recent years. Again, very successful. Another example of it would be the Information Fusion Centre in Singapore, a centre that's designed specifically to link up information centres around the world in order to provide kind of global coverage of what's actually happening or in the world's oceans. But nonetheless, there are limits. There are limits to this, and we see it in more recent operations. For example, the Philippine hurricane that happened recently, not conducted as a collaborative exercise by ASEAN, even though ASEAN had just conducted a big exercise in humanitarian assistance and disaster response a few months before. The limits on searching for the Malaysian airplane, for example, the reluctance of countries to pass on information, or their simple inability to pass on information about plotting aircraft over the sea. And of course, it does raise questions about capability? To what extent do countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, have the capacity to do that? So there are real problems with regional maritime cooperation in reality. Probably the biggest single problem is this, that I'm sure we'll be talking about more later on. The fact that the South China Sea is such an area of contention, the same much for the East China Sea as well, clearly makes the maintenance of good order at sea in a collaborative way very, very difficult. It raises issues about what people would do if there was some kind of serious incident in this area, particularly if it was anywhere in the South China Sea, really, because it's bound to be disputed by various countries. And how do you handle an incident? How do you handle a submarine accident? All sorts of things that can happen. The problem is that this is such an important area, and it's such an important issue. The importance that makes it something that we should be concerned and worried about is also the same reason why it's so difficult to solve it. If you look at this, for example, this is a picture of fishing boats in Hainan. It's an extraordinary sight. These fishing boats, artisanal fishing boats, stretch to the horizon. They're under pressure because fish stocks are going down. They're under pressure because of growing demand and declining stocks. The impact of industrial fishermen and all this sort of thing. This is a desperate community. And it's a desperate community that the local authorities simply can't afford to ignore. So they have to cater for them. They have to actually look after them. And this happens throughout the South China Sea. And it's often linked with sort of nationalism as well. The empowered citizen by IT, for example, now more and more of a stress, if you like, on governments painting them into a corner, reducing their capacity to keep control of events, always worrying. And it leads to incidents like this, for example, in the East China Sea, where you have kind of water fights by Coast Guard forces from the claimant nations, Japan and China, and I think there's a Taiwanese boat in there somewhere. Tremendous fun, of course, but terribly dangerous. Raising issues, of course, about where the demarcation line between white hulls and grey hulls ought to be. And imagine naval forces doing something like this, doesn't bear thinking about. Clearly in the South China Sea, major problems, meaning that this isn't going to go away. It's a permanent problem. There's no recourse to third-party settlement of the dispute. There's a failure to operationalise or even observe, many people would argue, the 2002 Declaration of Conduct that's supposed to regulate behaviour. No really effective negotiating forum, at least I would argue there isn't. And so not much of an ability to manage, still less resolve the problem. So the battle for maritime security produces those forces, it produces those concepts, and it's a difficult area. I just want to emphasise that it is a battle. This is something that's really important. And the fact of the matter is that the navies in this area are only partially successful in their likely ability to win it. Well, let me flick over lastly to this, the battle for strategic dominance. This is much more familiar to traditional maritime strategists like Mahan and Corbett and all the rest of them. It's basically, as far as concepts, I would deal with it in the same sort of way, those three issues: concepts and aspirations, fleet structure and acquisitions and operations. So let's start off with the concepts. I suppose the biggest issue now confronting navies in this region, and arguably the world, is in fact that. The balance to be struck between various ideas of sea denial and sea control, that's most dramatically represented by this notion of A2AD in the hands of China and air-sea battle in the hands of the United States. So, what are we talking about? What's sea denial, or A2AD? Well, it is negative. It's about preventing other people from doing what they want to do at sea. It's not necessarily about being able to do what you want to do at sea. It doesn't lead to anything that you can do, not immediately anyway. This is the way it's described in British doctrine. As far as it translates, according to many people in the region, it's about, and its application to this particular area, it's about China's defense, if you like, of the first island chain and the second island chain against intruding forces, by which I think we can normally read the Americans. The Chinese don't actually call it A2AD. They call it counter-interventionary operations or active defense of the near seas. It's only the United States that, with its penchant for snappy titles, that calls it A2AD. But this isn't, I just want to emphasize, this isn't the only example. There are others as well, not just in Asia too. Why does it matter? Well, as far as the United States is concerned, access to those first and second island chains, if you like, is important. In general, it's important. This is how they describe it in their latest doctrinal statement. Access gives you maneuver space. So if there is a battle over access, it being denied by sea denial and it being required, if you like, by the US, this is the kind of environment they're talking about. It's hugely complicated. I'm not going to go into it in any detail. Just get the point that what we're talking about is systems operations on both sides, but system in a rather different word. It's a variety of constituents, everything from carriers to aircraft to cyber to satellites and to everything else linked together. The A2AD defensive system and the access assuring system, if you like, on the part of the two sides. It's symmetrical. Both sides are trying to do the same thing, or trying to rely, if you like, on the same capabilities: long-range precision fire, superior situational awareness, as the Americans like to call it, and IT linkages. This is what's critical. Why does it matter? Well, arguably, as far as the United States is concerned, they need forward access in order to maintain their political relationships with their allies and partners in the area and to reassure them. They need to know what's going on in all parts of the world in order to be able to predict, maybe preempt, certainly to respond quickly. And it leads to the capability to maintain a forward presence, to secure sea control, and to be able to project power ashore. So as far as the battle for strategic dominance in terms of operations is concerned, it's about assuring access through the development of air-sea battle. But it's not the only example. You could argue that Vietnam is going in for a sea denial campaign against possibly China. You can see other examples in the Gulf. You can see historic examples. There's nothing new about this idea. And there are alternatives. In the United States, many argue that air-sea battle is far too escalatory, far too expensive, far too economic, technologically demanding. Perhaps instead we should go in for what's sometimes called an offshore control strategy. In other words, to intercept, if we ever need to, Chinese shipping on its way through those routes that I showed you earlier, to put that kind of pressure on China should the need ever arise. The result of that, should that happen, of course, would be air-sea battle with Chinese characteristics, because that's what the Chinese would need to do. And if they were envisaging operations against Vietnam, for example, they would certainly need some kind of air-sea battle concept, sea control battle of their own for that. So there's a kind of conceptual balance going on, if you like. As far as acquisitions is concerned, the size and shape of local fleets. Well, there are substantial campaigns of naval modernization going on after a period of relative neglect, especially in Northeast Asia, somewhat lower key in Southeast Asia. Heavy reliance on foreign suppliers. India, for example, the world's biggest importer of naval equipment. So naval modernization is going full steam ahead in the Asia-Pacific region. But don't exaggerate. It's steady rather than highly dramatic. Most countries in Southeast Asia still spend less than 2% of their GDP on defence. And that's general throughout the area. There are exceptions, Singapore, China, for example. The amounts they spend are sharply up. But that's not because of more effort, that's because of a consequence of economic growth. One of the exceptions, of course, is the United States. Most estimates say that the United States is going to remain greatly superior to China and Russia combined for the foreseeable future. In terms of tonnage, deployed aircraft, naval missiles, and so on and so forth. 18 of the world's 20 top navies are also allies to the United States, or partners. They also have a huge advantage in operational experience, decades and decades and decades of it, compared to China, for example. It's much closer, the balance between the two, of course, would be much closer in the Western Pacific than it is globally, and that's an important issue. Another cause of concern in Washington, at any rate, is about future trends by 2050, shall we say. But nonetheless, at the moment, the US has 289 ships, compared to about 400 20 years ago, but they've got 104 of them at sea, which, funnily enough, is exactly the same number as they had 20 years ago. So don't exaggerate American decline. Just let me flick through some of the local players very quickly, just to pick out a few things. Korea, this is indicative, the second generation of Korean submarines, indicative, if you like, of a challenge they're facing about the extent to which they focus on local defense against North Korea, as opposed to forward contributions to the system by participating in more distant operations. As far as the Chinese Navy is concerned, a lot of focus on this. Chinese naval build-up, much of it, I think, exaggerated. But nonetheless, they are getting advanced ships like these two, and producing, at the moment, a relatively small but sophisticated surface fleet. In terms of their submarines, interestingly, diesel-electric submarines, the one class there. These ones over there are interesting. SSBNs, the Jin class, the O-94s as they're known, part of a major campaign that's going on in China across the board to enhance their nuclear capabilities. And another interesting new area, which might or might not be associated with disputes over islands, is the LPDs that they're developing, the amphibious capabilities. And they've got even bigger ones, the O-81s on the way. New capabilities, in other words. But a lot of attention is focused on this, of course, their first aircraft carrier, recently launched. It'll be a long time before this is the centerpiece of a carrier battle group, American style, if ever. As far as Japan is concerned, submarines again, another area. Increase in Japanese submarine force to 22 from 16. A sort of focus on more distant operations, especially in the southwest, with the development of maritime defense observance aircraft, and of course this one here. It isn't an aircraft carrier; it's a destroyer. It happens to carry aircraft. Interesting one. The new class, that they've got two of those, and they're going to get two of the bigger ones down the bottom. One of the reasons why that's interesting is because by most people's reading of the Constitution of Japan, these things should be illegal. Because they're about offensive power, or aircraft carriers are usually considered to be so. And that might be one of the reasons why they don't call them an aircraft carrier. But it also might be one of the reasons why Mr. Abe is advocating somewhat of a reinterpretation of the Japanese constitution. Another interesting aspect of what Japan's doing is a big focus on dealing with North Korean or maybe Chinese missiles by their Aegis-class destroyers. Very expensive, very demanding. Australia, same focus on developing amphibious capability and air defence down the bottom there. Doubling their submarine force, producing the Canberra class, as you can see, an air warfare destroyer. But again, indicative. At the moment, spending 1.6% of their GDP on defence, not very high. Ideas about extending it up to 2% over the next few years, we'll see. India, plagued with problems in terms of getting equipment, partly because of the relationship between the military, the bureaucracy, and civilian control, a sort of unholy trinity in many ways. The development of the BrahMos missile down the bottom there, indicative of support and close relationships with Russia, and how important external relationships are. Singapore, small navy, very modern in many ways, networked. That's a critical one there. Focus on networking. Malaysia, more modest, but still effective. Again, the acquisition of submarines, a new capability, technologically and operationally demanding. Only 2 of them, deploying both at the moment to the South China Sea area. One wonders why. Indonesia. Again, the thing I would point out would be the Sigmas, offshore patrol vessels, but stealthy ones, very powerful, a bit more powerful than you'd need to deal with illegal fishermen and illegal people smuggling, you might think, but essential to the business of national integrity, and that's what those things are for as well. Other Southeast Asian countries illustrating various themes. Vietnam, well, as I say, building an A2AD system of their own with Russian frigates and submarines. Thailand biting off more than it can chew with getting an aircraft carrier a few years ago. Thinking about getting submarines. Philippines, interesting example, you might argue, of what happens to a country when it neglects coast guards and navies. In view of what's happening to its claims in the South China Sea. Operations, well, it seems to me that this is a permanent reminder of the realities. This is the South Korean corvette, the Cheonan, recently sunk, nearly everybody thinks, by the North Koreans. It's a real-world example about what sea control and sea denial really is. That's what it looks like now. It's a kind of shrine to the 46 people who died in it. And it's a reminder of what's at stake, what the operational focus is, if you like. But thankfully, in the major context between A2AD and sea battle, if you like, between China and the United States, this is all fantasy almost. This is a kind of political debate. And there is a political issue, or in a grand strategic sense, between China and the United States, if that's what you think it is, over this sort of issue. First of all, is the United States, its forward presence is discretionary. It's not a function of geography, it's a function of political choice. And therefore, arguably, the Chinese are therefore engaged in a process sometimes referred to as the 3 warfares, arguing first of all about the freedom of navigation and what's permissible and what isn't in the exclusive economic zone, where they take a distinctively different line to the United States, about challenging its political legitimacy by trying to secure support and from other countries in the region, and casting light through their A2AD capabilities, their carrier-killing ballistic missile, all that sort of thing, on the credibility of the United States' guarantee to its allies and partners in the region. So if that's the political part of the debate as seen from the China side, what about the American side? That's what the pivot is all about, it seems to me. Maintaining the importance of the Asia-Pacific region in America's global priorities, and demonstrating that by where they dispose their naval forces. 51 ships last year in the region, 58 this year, and the aim is to get 67 by 2020. Modest levels, you might think. Nonetheless, it's engaged in a widespread campaign across the region of political engagement with local allies and partners. 700 training events, as the Americans call it, a year, in the region, 170 multinational exercises of one sort or another, engaging with some interesting partners like the Vietnamese, for example. So what does all this mean, if anything? What does it tell us about future directions and so on and so forth? What would be the operational outcome of some kind of real-world classic encounter between China and the United States in this sort of conceptual area? Very hard to call, for a very simple reason. On both sides, you have systems which are linked together by IT. The effect on that of cyber attacks and cyber defense, absolutely critical. It's also an ambiguous focus for both. The extent to which this is a real issue rather than an imaginary issue, something dreamed up by, defense analysts around the world, if you like, I think is an interesting one. And there are, as far as there's far too many technological ambiguities. What forces are used, when are they used, how effective would they be in the real world? We just frankly don't know. And I think the biggest reason for skepticism is its sheer strategic implausibility. Both attack and defense have the acceptance of the idea of extending the battle, if you like, ashore. Either by using land-based systems against forces at sea, or preempting that by using forces at sea to take out land-based systems on both sides. And the notion of some kind of encounter at sea being kept at sea and not turning into a general war is, I think, implausible. But nonetheless, it has heuristic value. It's a kind of planning device that it seems to me, a conceptual device to help defence planners, not just in this area, but everywhere in the world, cope with an unpredictable future. So finally then, conclusions and trends. Well, I would argue that the balance between the focus on the two concepts of battle that I'm talking about are getting worse. That there's more emphasis these days than there was, say, 5-10 years ago on the battles for strategic dominance than on the battles for maritime security. And this kind of illustrates the point that navies, if you like, can be seen from two different angles. They're first of all symptoms of what's going on. The extent to which they're supported by resources, the extent to which they choose what their functions are, and the level of activity that they engage in, or illustrate, if you like, what's going on. But I think navies are also to be seen as causes. In other words, they do have a profound influence on what happens in this region and what the international context is. And I would argue this is particularly the case in the Asia-Pacific region because it is such an inherently and intrinsically maritime area. These things are important. And so for all of these reasons, I think what's going on in naval development in the Asia-Pacific region is something that's well worth keeping an eye on. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The second speaker today, Dr. Sam Bateman. He is retired from the Royal Australian Navy as a Commodore and is now a professional research fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security at the University of Wollongong. He's also an advisor at the Maritime Security Program at RSAS in Singapore, and his naval service includes 4 ship commands ranging from patrol boats and also to guided missile destroyers. He's nominated member of the ASEAN Regional Forum Expert and Eminent Persons Group. If you notice that both the speakers, they are, in part attached to RSIS in Singapore, and in fact, this was Sam's idea. The whole seminar, it was born in the corridors at RSIS. I was there as a visiting fellow, as a part of the Norway RSIS Memorandum of Understanding, where RSIS has conducted several services to Norway, especially governmental agencies. And while I was there, I gave a talk on the Arctic, and I told Sam and his other colleagues that the conditions in the Arctic are harsh and very demanding, with high waves, terrible weather, icing, and so forth. But Sam just came back from a tour from Hurtigruten, the coastal line in Norway, with beautiful weather, and he told me that the ocean looked like the floor of a living room. There was no waves at all. So now he doesn't believe me. But then I asked him to come back in January, perhaps. But we are very glad that you're able to stop by on your, make a short break in your vacation here in Europe. And we are very honored that you can speak here today. And Dr. Bateman, he will address legal and political issues, including the access to global commons and the unclosed debates, and also the good order at seas initiatives. Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Per-Erik, for that introduction, and thank you to the Institute for inviting us to give this seminar. And it's good to be back here at the Institute. I've paid a couple of visits here over the years in the past. My talk, as Per-Erik introduced it, is about some political and legal issues in maritime security in the East Asian seas. In a way, implicitly, Jeff had a theme about battles. Underlying my presentation is also a theme of battles, legal battles particularly, and to some extent political battles. Also lurking there is what you might call as the publicity battle, the public relations campaign, because I think we've seen a lot of this in global commentary in East Asian maritime security, particularly in recent times. And, you know, the way in which stories about particular incidents due to the web go viral around the world, we're certainly getting a situation where I think it's often global commentary of this nature can in fact distort the real situation. And I think when we look back on the South China Sea in particular over the last 15, 20 years, and I'm looking at our commentator here, Stein and I have been around the South China Sea in one way or other now for many, many years. Some of the best commentaries, legal commentaries in particular on the South China Sea, were written back in the 1990s. But I think in recent years we've seen all these distorted commentaries about the 9 dotted line, etc., and whose claims what, the sovereignty, nationalism type issue, and I think that's introduced an element of distortion into some of the situation as it really is. And I think, you know, I'll try in a way, and it wasn't one of my intentions originally, but I'll attempt to allay some of those distortions by talking about the situation. This is just an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Under the side heading of recent initiatives, I'll also say something about that recent situation we've had of the paracels between China and Vietnam, with the positioning of the Chinese oil rig off the paracels, allegedly, according to Vietnamese sources, and including also much global commentary, well inside Vietnam's EEZ. And that's the quote we often hear, and that's often the global perception, that Vietnam's totally in its right because that rig is well inside China's Vietnam's EEZ. And I think some of that, for the reasons I'll mention when I get round to it, is not entirely accurate. But firstly, I'd like to deal with the legal status of the East Asian seas. And here, again, we get one of these distortions creeping into the commentary. The seas of East Asia, starting from Northeast Asia with the Sea of Okhotsk, moving down through the Sea of Japan, East Sea as far as Koreans are concerned, the Yellow Sea, West Sea to the Koreans, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, the Sulu Sea, Celebes Sea between Borneo and the Philippines, the Andaman Sea, rest of the Malay Peninsula, and of course the Timor and Arafura Seas between Australia and Indonesia. These are all classed under the law of the sea as enclosed or semi-enclosed seas, which under the 1982 Convention, of course, has a special regime. And the first thing to say, we often hear, and particularly commentaries from the US, that these seas, particularly South China Sea, East China Sea, are international waters. Well, quite fundamentally, they are not international waters. They are the exclusive economic zones or territorial seas of the littoral countries. Now, the important factor is there that because these are enclosed and semi-enclosed seas, and because They include the EEZs, the coastal states. The coastal states have very important rights and obligations which detract from any consideration that they are international waters. Exclusive economic zones are, under the law of the sea, sui generis. It is clear in UNCLOS that EEZs are subject to their own specific legal regime under that particular UNCLOS article. All this, as I say, denigrate from the fact that any idea that these are international waters. And I think this has been an important factor which has tended to distort a lot of the considerations, including, of course, the United States' special regular references to the freedoms of navigation, etc., to the South China Sea, because freedoms of navigation in an exclusive economic zone, quite fundamentally under the law of the sea, are qualified freedoms. They're exercised subject to having due regard to the rights of the coastal state. So all these are factors which have to be taken into consideration, and as I said in my introduction, these issues were well appreciated up until probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when we had these distortions creeping in and misunderstandings regarding the legal status of these seas. I mentioned UNCLOS Part 9, and the particular article I want to draw attention here to is Article 122, which sets out the obligations of states that are literal to enclosed or semi-enclosed seas and what they should be doing. And that's the definition of these seas, and those seas, as I mentioned, meet that definition. To this end, the bordering states shall endeavour directly or through an appropriate regional organisation to coordinate the management, conservation, exploration, exploitation of living resources, so they've got a clear obligation to engage in cooperative fisheries management, then to preserve and protect the marine environment, to coordinate the marine scientific research activities, and if necessary to do all this in conjunction with an international organisation. The key point here is that despite positive movements towards implementing this cooperation that we saw in the region until about 2005, since then we have been going backwards, and the littoral countries are not fulfilling their obligations to engage in this cooperation. Interestingly, the 2002 Declaration on Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea reinforced this particular obligation, but in recent years this seems to have just dropped out of consideration, dropped out of regional debate. Moving on now to different, sorry, this is just going on with the obligations to cooperate. Addressing major regional differences with the law of the sea, and this is where we pick up on this battle theme, the differences of view between regional countries on law on the sea issues. The first one is rights and duties in the various maritime zones, particularly exclusive economic zones. And the two key questions here are military activities of freedom of the sea that can be conducted in an EEZ without the permission of a coastal state? And secondly, are military activities part of marine surveys as conducted by the United States, for example, part of marine scientific research and therefore under the jurisdiction of the coastal state and its EEZs? Some issues still with navigational regimes, particularly with regard to some coastal states requiring prior notification or prior authorisation of warship transit through their territorial sea. Then the issue of regime of islands. Are any of these features that are in dispute in the South China Sea, East China Sea, actually islands under the law of the sea and therefore entitled to their full suite of maritime zones? Underpinning this problem with rights and duties of states in their EEZ is this issue of due regard. And of course, it's a symmetrical relationship because the coastal state is required to have due regard to the rights and duties of other states in its EEZ, then other states are required to have due regard to the rights and duties of the coastal state when they undertake activities in the EEZ. But the vexed issue here is what is not having due regard and what is having due regard, and it's proved very difficult, in fact, to develop operational considerations, operational tests, if you like, of what type of activity might not have due regard to the rights of the coastal state, or alternatively, what regulation introduced by the coastal state might not have due regard to the rights and duties of other states. And as I mentioned first up, of course, it's significant, and this is a really vexed issue in this part of the world, because all those seas are mostly exclusive economic zones of coastal states. This is just a more strict amplification of what the relevant UNCLOS articles actually say. UNCLOS Article 58, brackets 3, talks about the rights, about the need for other states to have due regard to the rights and duties of the coastal state. And then Article 56, brackets 2, talks about the coastal state having due regard to the rights of other states. Now, an example of these types of issues, a recent example, but these activities are actually, there's been numerous examples of these over the last 10 or 15 years, where the basic issue, as I've been saying, is in fact the due regard test. The impeccable incident in March 2009. The incident occurred 75 nautical miles south of Hainan, therefore definitely, clearly inside China's EEZ. China alleged that Impeccable broke international and national laws without China's permission. Now, what China was actually saying here is that Impeccable, being a form of oceanographic ship, a form of survey ship, was in fact conducting a form of marine scientific research, and therefore that was something under jurisdiction of the coastal state, and therefore it was illegal. That was one part of China's argument. The other part of the Chinese argument was the general one, that the nature of the Impeccable's operation was not having due regard to the general rights and duties of the coastal state, because it was collecting intelligence, oceanographic information within China's EEZ. So China, in fact, had a case. The US, of course, also had a case, because the US argued that the vessel was undertaking military surveys. These were part of the military activities, which under the law of the sea, it was legitimate for the US to be conducting these military activities in the EEZ, because there are certain high seas freedoms which apply in an EEZ. So you can see that both sides, in fact, had some basis for their position in the dispute. Some of the issues here in more detail that add to the ambiguity and the dilemmas of the situation. The first one is that many of the key expressions that we see bandied around here are not in fact defined in UNCLOS. Marine scientific research actually itself is not defined in the convention. Hydrographic surveys, military activities, military surveys, none of these terms are actually strictly defined. The freedom of navigation issue in an EEZ, other states exercising the freedom of navigation in a country's EEZ, comes out of some ambiguities, weasel wording, if you like, compromises within the convention's language. In Article 87, there's a reference to inter alia, that these freedoms of the high seas, listing out the freedoms, but then they include other freedoms, are available in the EEZ. That inter alia is interpreted as including military activities. Similarly, in Article 58, brackets 1, there's a reference to other internationally lawful uses of the sea. Now that, again, is interpreted as a reference to military activities, but you have to read behind the convention and know the background of the convention to understand this particular argument. Several regional countries, and in fact almost a majority of regional countries, do claim that military activities, including military surveys, cannot be conducted in their EEZ without their permission. Countries here include China, India, Malaysia, Thailand, who've formally made that statement, but Japan and South Korea, in fact, are a bit ambiguous on this particular issue. In some ways, Japan seems to be very sensitive to military activities in its EEZ, likewise South Korea. Looking at the legal situation here, international law is clear on most of the issues we're talking about associated with the conduct of marine scientific research. It makes clear that marine scientific research requires prior authorisation of a coastal state in internal waters, territorial sea, archipelagic waters, and then goes on, coastal states having exclusive rights to regulate, authorise and conduct marine scientific research in the CEZ. Hydrographic surveying, as I mentioned, is not actually defined in the Convention. It loosely pops up in a number of places, and we'll come to that. But firstly, military surveys, as the US talks about them. The US argues that military surveys are akin to hydrographic surveys and not subject to coastal state jurisdiction in the EZ. Now that hangs quite basically on an assumption that hydrographic surveys are not part of marine scientific research, are something different to marine scientific research, and are captured loosely by some loose references in the Convention to surveys. Military surveys and marine data collection for military purposes, and of course, particularly in seas with oceanographic conditions that we have in East Asia, knowledge of the oceanographic conditions is hugely important for anti-submarine warfare, submarine operations, mine countermeasures, and so on. The United Kingdom is a bit more clever here because they don't actually use that argument about military surveys being similar to hydrographic surveys. They make a direct link for their data collection to military activities more generally and talk about military data gathering in an EEZ. Military surveys can undertake a whole lot of range of activities: hydrographic, oceanographic, geological, geophysical, chemical, intelligence collection, and so on. And of course, the basic point here, of course, is the claim that this data collected in that way is for use by the military and not by the general scientific community. However, hydrographic surveying is, it's evolved over the years since the Convention was put together. And I think the argument that hydrographic surveys are different to marine scientific research have become weaker, even if indeed there is any validity in that particular argument. UNCLOS mentions surveys in several different articles, but it's a vague reference, and when you look at those references, they're all in the context of navigational regimes, and they look as though they're instead of trying to create a separate type of activity, they're more an amplifying activity in the types of activities that a ship shouldn't conduct when it's undertaking innocent passage through a territorial sea or whatever. The trends with hydrography over the years, I mean, the fundamental point with hydrography is to make an argument that hydrographic surveying is fundamentally important to, safety of navigation, etc., is to ignore the other increasingly more important uses of hydrographic data. And I'm referring here particular to the management, coastal zone management, economic development, coastal engineering, all these other type of activities which are part of the rights and duties of a coastal state in the CEZ. Hydrographic surveying has become, has changed in nature from just being about navigational safety. And I think these, including of course the wide utility of hydrographic survey data, really strengthens the idea that really the argument that hydrography is not part of marine scientific research, I think, is weakened, but we could come back to that. Now I'd like to move on to a second main theme of my talk, all this issue about nationalism and sovereignty claims at sea, and the idea that we can have fences in the sea. We can say we, as a country, we own out to that particular maritime boundary, that particular fence in the sea, and that we can manage maritime space on the basis of sovereignty. I think in the East Asian seas, for a number of reasons I've mentioned, that's no longer really applicable. I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult to manage. Some of the reasons why: straight line maritime boundaries in a conventional sense are going to be difficult to achieve. Obviously the sovereignty disputes, excessive use of territorial sea straight baselines by most East Asian countries, the geography of the region with several mainland countries and the island countries offshore. The fact that there's no areas of high seas, and certainly no, as I've mentioned, no international waters. The fact that by virtue of the geography we're going to have multiple tri-points where the boundaries of three countries intersect further complicates the whole issue of maritime boundary making. Then, of course, the issue of determining which features qualify as islands and therefore may be given some weight in maritime boundary delimitation. Looking at some of the issues here, 2009, Malaysia and Vietnam lodged a submission for a joint extended continental shelf claim in the South China Sea. This, of course, had the effect of denying any of the other countries, Brunei or the Philippines or Indonesia, any other claims in this particular area. Effectively, it was a claim to say that, you know, we have the whole lot here as a continental shelf. But as I show here, the size of this area was measured from Vietnam's straight baselines, which are very largely excessive under the international law, and also from Malaysia's straight baselines, which also are a bit suspect under international law. The fact that there's no areas of high seas, of course, if we just measured an area of high seas from the mainland coast, there'd be this coffin-shaped area which would be high seas. But if any of these islands qualify as proper islands under the law of the sea, this area would be largely closed off. The issue of multiple tri-points, and this just illustrates where some tri-points might be required. Now, as we know, I mean, people with any experience of maritime boundary making will know that negotiating tri-points and boundaries is hugely difficult. And a fine example of that in our region is the eastern and western approaches to the South China Sea, to the Singapore Strait. There's areas where there's in fact no maritime boundaries between the three countries concerned, Indonesia, Malaysia and Singapore. And that's simply because whilst there's maritime boundaries that come down the Malacca Strait between Indonesia and Malaysia, and within the Singapore Strait itself there's a boundary between Singapore and Indonesia and one between Singapore and Malaysia, and similarly out into the east, the three countries have been unable, in an area of roughly probably 5 by 5 kilometres, have been unable to agree a tri-point. And so just imagine when you extrapolate that out, you can see some of the difficulties of maritime boundary making in this part of the world. Whether or not there are islands in the South China Sea is a hotly debated issue as well. Vietnam in particular, because of the influence on its maritime boundaries and its long coastline onto the South China Sea, argues that none of the islands in the South China Sea actually qualify as strict islands. This is a bit debatable because really there's the words in the convention about tests of sustaining human habitation and economic life. They become a bit archaic now because the main recognition is now of size as being the main criteria of whether an island is an island or not. So it rather looks as though, the second dot point here, that there are real islands in the South China Sea if you look at international standards and compare the size of these islands in the South China Sea with those other international. Now, this is just a table of mainly focused on the region. There's probably ones from elsewhere around the world of size of islands. The larger islands, Ituabu, roughly approximately 40 hectares, Thitu, Woody Island, very large island, also Duncan Island, and these islands in the Paracels. And look at islands elsewhere. Japan has this notorious example of Okinawa Torishima out in the Pacific, where you've only got a little few patches that are rocks, but they claim a full exclusive economic zone continental shelf from it. The US has a number of islands in the South Pacific, off-lying islands. Australia has some elsewhere. So, you know, there's a good argument that there are real islands in the South China Sea which are going to be taken into consideration when it comes to boundary delimitations. So the key questions, summary here, is can we have fences in the sea? And if we can't have fences in the sea, shouldn't we be giving up the idea that we're going to manage the South China Sea on the basis of sovereignty alone? Shouldn't we really be focusing on the cooperative management of the seas and their resources using some other means that is not based on sovereign jurisdiction? Just mention now, just as an example, I said I'd talk about the oil rig crisis. Here's the furthest out island of the Paracels. Here's the Vietnam coast. Here's the location of the oil rig. And it's this distance off, note, from Vietnam's limited little island here they use for their straight baseline claims, and this distance to the larger woody island feature in the Paracels. The bottom line here, I mean, as I mentioned initially, Vietnam and a lot of international commentary is saying that this rig is well inside Vietnam's EEZ. However, is that really so? Does China have a case? Much of it comes back to who has sovereignty over the Paracels, and that, of course, is an issue of dispute. Until comparatively recently, whilst China and Vietnam had a Vietnam had a dispute with China over the sovereignty, I'd argue that much international commentary, much international legal opinion, until probably about the last 5 or 6 years, actually accepted Chinese sovereignty over the Paracels. That dispute has surged into more prominence in recent years. The situation is certainly complex, but my basic point here is, of course, that there's arguments on both sides. China actually does have an argument for placing that oil rig there, even though international commentary in recent months, of course, has largely run against China. Some recent initiatives on this whole issue, this coming back to that issue of due regard. The Ocean Policy Research Foundation of Japan has put a lot of work over, one way or another, the best part of the last 10 years, into trying to establish principles for conducting navigational overflight activities in the exclusive economic zone of the other country, trying to define some principles for identifying what's having due regard and what's not having due regard to the rights of coastal state. The latest version was released quite recently of these principles, and I've got hard copy here, which I'll leave with Per-Erik but they're available also on the web with the website given there. And they focus, as I say in the last dot point here, on this whole issue of due regard, trying to establish some ideas, guidelines, if you like, on what's having due regard and what's not having due regard. The basic principle of them is that with military activities conducted by another state in the EEZ of a coastal state, they shouldn't interfere with or endanger the rights and jurisdiction of the coastal state to protect and manage its resources and the marine environment, i.e. you wouldn't, for example, you wouldn't conduct military activities in a marine park that had been established legitimately by the coastal state. You wouldn't conduct military activities in an area of high fishing activity, those sort of issues, and the marine scientific research business. Some example of the principles. These have been vexed issues, and I've just picked these out as examples of how these principles deal with some of the more vexed issues. Legitimate to conduct maritime surveillance in the EEZ of a coastal state. The second dot point is the one that getting over that military activities, warships, despite the claims by some coastal states, are legitimate in the EEZ of a coastal state. And then lastly, the one dealing with hydrographic surveying. Another example of a recent initiative is the so-called Code for Unalerted Encounters Between Ships, which was agreed recently at a meeting of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium in Qingdao in China in April. This effectively is a non-binding region-wide incident sea agreement, and I know Norway has an incident sea agreement with the Soviet Union. I think it's still in force regarding with Russia. And it says all the usual sort of things that you expect to see in an inked sea agreement, covering, the activities that might emerge between ships and aircraft having close encounters at sea. Like ships should avoid actions such as illuminating other ships' bridges or aircraft cockpits, or simulating attacks by aiming guns or weapon systems, etc. A form of cues has actually been in existence in the region now for about 10 years, but basically ships not just Chinese ships, US ships. Nobody had these documents on the bridge of their ships, so it was really just a political gesture. It wasn't something which was working in practice. However, hopefully this new version will be something that will work in practice. Now, last issue I want to talk about, and Jeff's already referred to this, is just this whole issue of good order at sea in the region and the importance of having good order at sea. Particularly when you've got these enclosed and semi-enclosed seas. I mean, it's just fairly obvious that cooperation is just so fundamentally important to doing anything in these seas. And again, one of my basic themes is that unfortunately in recent years, for a variety of reasons, which might pop up in our Q&A session, we've gone backwards, I think, in the East Asian seas with the right form of cooperation. The reasons why we lack good order at sea: sovereignty and boundary disputes, lack of maritime boundaries. Countries are focusing on their fences in the sea. They're focusing on their national claims to sovereignty, both over land features and over water space, maritime space. Countries have not signed up for relevant international conventions. Even the Search and Rescue Convention is not well ratified in the region, and the regional differences with the law of the sea. There are pressing reasons to press on with the cooperation. As I mentioned, it's an obligation in the 2002 Declaration on Conduct of Parties. Resource pressures, overfishing present in the region. Jeff pointed to the problems of overfishing. Environmental degradation, destruction of marine habitats, explosive fishing on reefs, the whole box and dice. And these reefs in the reef systems in the South China Sea are everywhere a bit as valuable and as sensitive as, for example, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. And yet there is no effective management regime, no effective protection of these reef systems at present. Shipping traffic increasing, and we're really heading to a tragedy, classic tragedy of the commons, unless something is done about it. As I mentioned earlier, again, the Declaration on Conduct of Parties in 2002 listed these as areas for cooperation. Recent statements on the Code of Conduct, it's to implement that doc. Recent statements on the Code of Conduct have made no reference to the cooperation that's required, and I think that's just a classic example of how we've gone backwards. Again, some of the reasons why we're missing a... That's probably a repeat of the side, isn't it? So, my major argument is that cooperation and effective management of the South China Sea and activities within it has proven difficult to achieve, and the fundamental reason why it's difficult to achieve is that bordering countries have now got this fixation on their claims to sovereignty over offshore features and maritime space. And I think we had a very fine example of that in recent weeks, particularly with those riots and demonstrations in Vietnam. Strident assertions of sovereignty, completely counterproductive in terms of looking forward to the cooperation required in the region. So, the conclusion, this fixation on sovereignty is misplaced. We require change of mindsets. How are we going to achieve that is, of course, the vexed issue. And we require to get back to the whole game of functional cooperation, which, as I've mentioned several times already, is where we were actually heading in the region up until about 2007, 2008. Since then, we've gone backwards. And I've got some reasons why we've gone backwards, and I haven't mentioned them, but they might come out in the Q&A. So on that point, I'll conclude. Thank you, Perik.
Sam. I'd like to ask all the three panelists to take their place in front here, and there should be a microphone for you last time.
Yeah, I should between you. Yeah, that's all right.
Now, there will be a panel debate and also a Q&A. You can, of course, ask questions from this room. Also, those of you watching on internet, you can send questions on Twitter. So if you use hashtag NUPI-seminar, I will read them, and I can also ask the panelists from the internet audience, if possible. Now, please state your name and affiliation, and also wait for a microphone so the internet audience also can hear your question. First, I would like to ask the commentator, Stein Tønneson, to comment on these two distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard here are two prominent members of an epistemic community of experts on maritime issues in East Asia, who have been meeting for many, many years, but more and more frequently in the last few years because of all the incidents. If this epistemic community has a father, it is the Indonesian ambassador Hashim Jalal, who started the Managing Potential Conflicts in the South China Sea workshops in 1990. I think that the two speakers have today covered a lot of ground, or a lot of water, so I will just engage with three issues. And the first is cooperation, the second is grand strategy, and the third is law. The point I want to make on the cooperation is that actually there is quite a lot of cooperation also in the area. Fishery agreements, Geoff Till mentioned how the Sabah issue last year was resolved through delicate handling. I think many of you will probably not know the details of that conflict simply because it didn't become a big conflict, but just an episode. And I would also emphasize that there are also maritime boundary agreements in the region between Malaysia and Vietnam, between Malaysia and Thailand, between Indonesia and Vietnam, and notably between China and Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin, where they agreed in 2000 on a maritime boundary agreement that is done just out of the book of international law. So there is a precedent there for cooperation. Sam Bateman has argued for so many years, has a number of ideas for cooperation and for various conflict prevention measures to be undertaken in the region. Most of this has not been realized, so often we can feel disappointed, but there is also cooperation out there. That's my first point. The second point is not about the small naval strategy, but the grand strategy, and I speak mainly to the grand strategy of China. China, if it looks ahead and at its maritime issues, has in a way three possible scenarios. One is the scenario of war. And war is a distinct possibility because an incident could escalate and become a confrontation. But if there is a real risk of US intervention in such a situation, it is really a strong Chinese interest to avoid it. Because war would be absolutely catastrophic for China, and there would be relatively little chance of winning it against US and its allies. So for China, the game is about managing the incidents in a way that does not lead to the risk of a war where the United States would intervene. The second scenario is status quo, and that's the most likely one. And I would emphasize the status quo is dangerous. Status quo is not stable. Status quo, when you have a lot of territorial disputes, plus an arms buildup of the kind that we heard Geoff Till talk about and visualized with all the pictures from the various countries in the region, this is dangerous. And there is a constant risk of tension and incidents that will all the time be managed. China and also other countries are now putting a lot of effort into designing tactics that will not lead to escalation into direct warfare. And one of those tactics is, for instance, to use water cannons. Another one is to have fishermen as the front line that are trained to be the front line in the incidents. So they are civilians, and then to have a number of civilian agencies that with very advanced equipment and ships that take over afterwards so that the Navy can stay at a distance. Because a direct naval interference is undesirable because of the great risk. That's the most likely scenario, and I think therefore that our epistemic community will have a number of conferences for many years also in the future, because we are going to see more and more of these incidents. But from the Chinese point of view, the third option, the third scenario, is the one that makes strategic sense. And that is to go for conflict resolution. To go for a boundary delimitation agreement in steps with various countries through mostly bilateral but also multilateral negotiations, and arrive at a system that ensures its security and peace through friendship and agreements with its neighbors. And this is mainly about having agreements with Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam, because they are the ones that have the most overlapping claims with China. My prediction is that if you have a relatively stable and secure Chinese government with an ability to look into the future, it will aim in that direction. Because that is also the way to continue to rise in power vis-à-vis the United States. As long as the United States is called for to protect the other countries in the region, as it will as long as they have disputes with China, China can at no point rival or pass US power in the global system. The only way it could do that is to maintain relatively good relations with the United States while it resolves its issues with the neighboring states, so that it can then silently bypass the United States in power. That would be the only sensible strategy for China if China has a secure and stable government. But, and this is the third point, that is about law. This kind of resolution can only be done on the basis of international law. And that includes mainly the law of the sea when it comes to maritime boundary agreements. But this is extremely difficult for China, because China has expectations and discourses that go against international law on so many points. Plus also they have to coordinate with Taiwan, because Taiwan's government defends the same positions as China. And China cannot risk doing something that Taiwan will criticize. So you need coordination with Taiwan, which requires improvement with Taiwan, and you need to overcome a lot of difficulties in the understanding of international law if you look at Chinese discourses. One was pointed to by Sam Bateman, that is the basic difference between land and sea. On land, there are some parts of international law that decide on sovereignty, and they are based on effective control over a period of time, the history of effective control. At sea, it's a question of distance from land. Distance from land is what decides what you have a right to at sea. You cannot just have a map showing how much you want. Maps have actually very limited importance in international law when it comes to deciding who's who has the right to a maritime zone. So this U-shaped line in the South China Sea is very, very weak status in international law, but it's seen as kind of holy by most Chinese, because they have seen these maps map this on all their maps all the time. And there are a number of other technical details in the law of the sea that are quite determinant, that are very difficult for the Chinese to accept, because it reduces the maritime zones that they can have relative to what they expect. And it forces them to enter into negotiations where the distance to other countries' coasts will count. They also run into big problems with having zones around small islands. In those cases where small islands are controlled by others, they want them to have small zones. In those cases where they expect to control the islands themselves, they want to have big zones. But here there are precedents set as well. So what we are seeing internally in China today is battle, a kind of war going on in China with itself. Because on the one hand, it has its extravagant claims. On the other hand, it has also its obligation to follow international law and use international law. This is just now played out in connection with the Philippines' request for an arbitral tribunal to decide on certain issues that have to do with the Spratly Islands. This arbitral tribunal, China refused to take part in it. And then the arbitral tribunal decided that we can only decide the case if we have heard China's argument. So they gave China a deadline in December this year to provide it with its legal claims and arguments. Of course, this is where China has not decided itself, because it is not ready to define what is its claims. So China just refused. This now leaves the arbitral tribunal to either decide that it cannot handle the matter because it has not heard one party, or it must itself develop the Chinese arguments through its own effort, and then try to decide on the dispute between the Philippines and China. Then the big issue, if this latter thing happens, is will China respect the result? And I think we will see here a test of China's overall relationship to international law. If more countries are bringing up matters in the way that the Philippines has done, and Vietnam can do it now, over this oil rig affair, because it was in disputed area, it can ask an arbitral tribunal to decide, was China in violation of international law when it placed an oil rig in an area that is disputed? And it's quite likely that an arbitral tribunal would find that China is in violation of international law, and then China would be obliged to remove the platform and not undertake similar actions in the future. If China justifies such a verdict, the rest of the world would know something about how China relates to international law, and that would seriously increase the risk that the first or the second scenarios will happen. Thank you.
Good, Tennyson, for those both commentary and also reflections on this topic. But before we open up for questions from the audience, I would just ask Till, do you have any remarks, short remarks, preferably?
Well, on what we just heard, yes, it's interesting. I just come from the Shangri-La dialogue, where there was quite a lot of talk about Vietnam following Philippines' example. And this was a question that was specifically put to the foreign minister, I think, of Vietnam. And his argument was along the lines of, yes, but as a last resort, rather than a first resort, because it would do exactly what you've just said, Stein. It would actually be seen as provocative. It would paint China into a corner, and that is not seen as a very sensible way to proceed. So the preference is for some kind of negotiated settlement, or even more if the Chinese move their oil rig. But the strength of feeling exemplified by the Vietnamese just demonstrates exactly what Sam was talking about. And that, in a sense, we've moved beyond rationality as far as many of these issues are concerned, and that is the most dangerous thing of all.
Thank you. Bateman, do you have any short comments?
I suppose just on this theme, I'm in fact sceptical that Vietnam would actually go to international arbitration, because the fundamental point it would open up is the issue of sovereignty over the Paracels. And I think most legal commentary over the years has been more on China's side than Vietnam's side. And an international arbitration may well find against Vietnam's interests in that regard. And I think the whole point of international arbitration is that countries can't afford for their own public consumption, domestic consumption, to be seen to lose an international arbitration case. And that would be the big risk from Vietnam's point of view.
Very short comment to this. I think that Vietnam may be unlikely to do it for Geoff Till's reason, but I think it could easily overcome your objection, because it would be simply a request to decide if it is illegal to do it in disputed waters. And they can be disputed either because of the dispute over the Paracels or because of the distance from the Vietnamese coast, because they are more than 12 nautical miles from Triton Island in the southern part of the Paracels. And even more importantly, the arbitral tribunal would not have any right under the law of the sea to decide on the sovereignty to any island. It would just decide if it's in violation to do it in disputed waters, and if it's disputed.
But international arbitration could also decide that it can't decide.
It could say that, yes.
Okay, with that, we'll leave it up to the audience to bring questions. But I'd like to mention one thing is that I was in Washington, D.C. on a conference on security in Asia this winter. And like you heard, some of these islands that they're disputing in these waters are hardly islands. Some of them are, barely rocks sticking up out the water ocean. But I told everyone that when Norway and Denmark prior to World War II had a dispute regarding the sovereignty of Greenland, there was no such debate. But first question. From the back here with a white shirt.
Yeah, hello. I'm Anton Dalby. I work for the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Just a quick question on the Vietnam-China possibility for like an arbitration. If you take Stein's point that you just want an opinion about if this is legal in disputed waters, wouldn't Vietnam be in trouble since they have their own rigs nearby?
Yes.
Good point.
There are comments? Next question.
Thank you very much.
Please wait for the microphone then.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Håkon Svane. I work at the Norwegian Ship Owners Association, and we organize, among other types of ship owners, many ship owners that work in the offshore oil and gas exploration areas around the world. And my question goes to all of you. Basically, you all use the term disputed areas. The Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs discourages Norwegian businesses from conducting business in disputed areas, including in the maritime domain. If you look at the South China Sea, there's now fairly large areas, maritime areas, with a lot of resources, at least potentially, that could be interesting to explore by coastal states, as we've seen in the case of the Vietnamese-China dispute. My question is whether there is sort of a common agreement among legal and research experts on what actually constitutes a disputed area. Does it only take one party among all the states in that particular sea basin to define the whole area as disputed, and should that be cause for international businesses to stay away from those areas? Thank you.
Very good question. Bateman would like to open up the response.
That's a good question, and there's no easy definition because it's all a question of degree. I mean, one of the stumbling blocks currently with getting an agreed code of conduct in the South China Sea is that there's not an agreement on what area to be covered. China, for example, blocks any code of conduct which would include the paracels because it believes it has indisputable sovereignty over the paracels. Philippines over the years, and Stein knows more about this probably than I do, has made several attempts to define an area of disputed waters. But again, it's from an offshore oil industry point of view, it's again one of those issues, like I was talking about during my presentation, that tends to be a bit exaggerated, for example. I mean, there's a whole, as you well know, there's a whole lot of offshore oil and gas activity going on in the South China Sea, particularly off Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei to some extent, which theoretically is in disputed waters, but nobody really believes they are disputed waters. A lot of this activity is inside, for example, China's 9-dash line. Now, China has never protested that activity. So, you know, there's not a short answer, but it's a question of degree.
One step on the way to conflict resolution might be to decide on disputed waters, disputed areas, to decide that a certain area is disputed. My first answer, which was just yes, I would say that yes, it's a problem for Vietnam if its oil activities are in an area that is closer to another coast than Vietnam's undisputed own coast, and within the 200 nautical miles from another coast. So and I'm not sure if Vietnam has oil installations that are in such a position, but the 9-dash line cannot be used as a basis for saying what is disputed. It can simply only be understood in international law as a claim to the islands inside it and their maritime zones.
Yeah, as my two colleagues have just said, what's in dispute lies in the eye of the beholder. China irritates people all the time by talking about indisputable sovereignty over the whole of the South China Sea, in effect, which argues that as far as the China side is concerned, it's not a disputed area. Oddly enough, they then criticise Japan for doing exactly the same thing over the Senkaku Islands, saying that that's not a disputed area. And this is a problem. This is effectively trying to come up with a watertight definition which everybody would accept. And I think it's probably impossible in the current situation. situation because it's a chicken and egg situation. The fact that one side regards it as indisputable means that there's no incentive, no requirement, and no possibility of actually entering into a real dialogue about how to manage the problem, because that might imply that, after all, it is disputed. But the point that I think was very important that came out from both of my colleagues in earlier answers was that settling this issue is a precondition. That fundamentally, unless this issue is actually resolved, the real exploitation of the economic resources of this or any other disputed area won't happen. And since the fundamental requirement of local states is to exploit the whole area, this is a kind of counterfactor, this is counterproductive. So we have a sort of paradox of a situation where what is required to actually get what they want, which is economic resources, long-term regime stability and all the rest of it, are kind of made difficult by the fact that neither side are willing to admit that there is a dispute.
Thank you for those responses. I think in sum, we can conclude on that Norwegian businesses don't have to change their modus operandi in the short-term future. But however, in the long term, the situation might change. I use my prerogative as chair, and then we'll ask Jeff Till about the phenomenon we've seen that with increased hostilities in the region, the normal practice of separating Coast Guard activity with military naval activity has been with a firewall, usually among Western nations. But now in the South China Sea, East China Sea especially, we've seen the more hostile use of the Coast Guards in that region. So you can please elaborate on that.
It's an interesting issue. On the face of it, one would argue that Coast Guards are the natural way of enforcing sovereignty for all sorts of reasons. The first one is, of course, that it requires practices that are policing practices and that require the same kind of standards of judicial activity as any other crime-busting activity on shore, in terms of the collection of evidence and proper treatment of suspects and all that sort of thing. So in a sense, an agency whose sole task it is to do the policing function would seem to be better equipped at doing it. The second one is the argument that it's much less escalatory than using naval forces to engage in that kind of activity, especially where sovereignty is in dispute. And as I mentioned, that the notion of naval vessels acting in the kind of dangerous way that we saw those white ships behaving in the East China Sea, for example, would be horrendous were those ships to be naval. There is a counter, which is to say, of course, that it's just because it's so dangerous that navies wouldn't do that sort of thing, that suggests that perhaps there is something to be said for a naval engagement in the process anyway. But what one is seeing, actually, in the South China Sea, and to some extent the East China Sea, is a combination of the two. When the Chinese sent their oil rig into the water, they must have been assuming trouble because it went accompanied by 80 ships. Most of them were Coast Guard or fishing boats, but an outer ring were naval ships. And that's the way that all of the claimants, if they can, tend to operate, using both the Navy in support of the Coast Guard.
Thank you for that response. We have several questions now from the audience. So what I'll do is I'll take 3 questions, and so you can please respond, to some of these questions. So the first question off is here, blue shirt.
Ola Thunander from the Peace Research Institute. I was in Beijing recently and had talked or interviewed with some central people, and my understanding is that from the Chinese side, they think that there was an agreement from the 1970s not to agree about the sovereignty issues and not least with Japan, and this was done to be able to continue economic activities and not disturb this thing. And what happened from 2009 and so on was that they had a closer collaboration with the Democratic Party in Japan and with China, and where they wanted to get rid of the Okinawa base and so on. And this led to some criticism from the right-wing side in Japan and from United States. And what they did was then to just push the sovereignty button, so you could you could easily trigger a conflict and calibrate the level of tension, so to speak. And that is and that was, according to their understanding, the background for what happened, actually. Thank you.
Can you please get a microphone through there?
Hello. My name is Harald Hovel. I'm an advisor with the Center for International Strategic Analysis here in Oslo. My question goes directly to Professor Till. In your brief, you showed a short picture and mentioned shortly the GIN class, SSBN, which is becoming operational this year, they claim. And as that happens, when the China now gets its first credible undersea nuclear deterrent, the next class, 96, is probably been planned, and also the next missile, JL-3, with longer range. Assuming that protecting its underwater nuclear deterrent has the same priority as with other states operating it, and assuming, it's a lot of assumption, assuming that they will operate it eventually in a bastion concept in the central South China Sea, which is probably the most obvious, how do you see this will affect and impact the situation in South China Sea, as we see here? Chinese approach to the conflicts or the disputes in the South China Sea. Thank you.
And the third question from the person behind you.
Hi, my name is Rolf Christian Eilertsen. I'm a student at University of Oslo, and I want to thank you for speaking with us. I have a question for Professor Till regarding China's quest for sea power and its focus on developing power projection capabilities and aircraft carriers. There's been a lot of controversy regarding that because many see China as primarily land power and should therefore focus on anti-access and area denial capabilities. I just want to ask you whether China's quest for traditional sea power does that come out from real strategic considerations, or is it mainly because of national prestige and naval nationalism, like, for example, the luxury fleet of the German Empire before the First World War? Thank you.
Uncomfortable analogy.
Thank you. Till, can you please answer the two latest questions?
Yeah.
And there's the panel, the first question.
Okay, SSBN bastions, one of the reasons why the Chinese were so sensitive about the activities of the Impeccable was that it was around about 80 miles away from the likely base of their SSBNs in the bottom of Hainan. So I think it's one of those technological imperatives that's slowly changing the situation in the South China Sea. Its strategic significance, if you like, is increasing, and that means that there's more at stake as far as China is concerned, and I think that's part and parcel of the problem, and that seems to me likely to be an influence on China's policy towards the South China Sea. But it's just one imperative amongst many. And I think it's wrong to think of China, if you like, as a kind of unitary actor, that there are different constituencies of opinion about policy and with different responsibilities, some civil, some foreign, some strategic, and genuine differences of view as to what the objective is and what the means of getting to the objective should be are. So I'm not sure that having just identified the standard sort of argument that of strategic rationale for this kind of policy, that it actually is what's driving Chinese policy now. But I do think that the technological trend is in that direction, and that it is making a difficult situation even more difficult. And it's part and parcel of a large-scale program of Chinese development of their nuclear forces for all sorts of entirely legitimate reasons, I hasten to say. I'm not saying it's illegitimate, but which does raise all sorts of issues. Like, for example, the traditional emphasis on Chinese nuclear policy being no first use, that it would never be used first in any circumstances whatsoever. That these days is subject to slightly more qualified observations about the future within the Chinese strategic community than one is used to in the past. And this raises all sorts of larger issues that are at stake in the appearance of these vessels. On the second of those questions of whether China is a maritime power or not, and is it kind of natural that it should develop these sorts of capabilities, I think it's very interesting to see within the strategic community in China a growth of interest in traditional thinking about sea power. Mahan used to be regarded as a kind of colonialist lackey that nobody would possibly pay attention to, but these days he seems to be studied for what he said. And the example of Britain, France, the European countries' maritime rise and fall is widely studied with a view to what its lessons and what its implications are today. So in all those sorts of ways, there is a genuine interest in the strategic community about the notion of China becoming the maritime power that President Hu and President Xi both say it should be. What a maritime power means, however, is slightly less clear. All of the emphasis hitherto has been on a maritime power within a restricted geographic area, i.e. the Western Pacific, to all intents and purposes, with a big focus on maintenance of sovereignty in disputed areas, South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. But I think there's a growth of interest that's in wider issues. I think it's very significant that in 2011, 35,000 Chinese citizens were evacuated by air from Libya during the course of the civil war. But the Luzhou, one of their air defense frigates, was standing by. And this strikes me as being the pattern for the future. Because China is more and more integrating the world economy, it's got more and more at stake in just the same way that the United States, European countries have in what happens in distant places. A kind of duty, if you like, to look to their distant interests. And that requires, and this is an argument made by the PLAN, naval forces. It also requires, this is interesting, comes back to the point that Sam was talking about earlier on, about thinking as maritime powers. The Chinese line, for example, on what the British call military data gathering in the exclusive economic zone, I think is subject to change. One has seen commentators accepting last year, for example, I mean Chinese officials, sorry, not commentators, saying last year at the Shangri-La dialogue that actually they engage in military data gathering on a reciprocal basis outside Guam and Hawaii, saying it in public for the first time. And some of them seem to be distinguishing between two different types of military data gathering in other people's exclusive economic zones. One is strategic, and that seems to mean, we don't know, it's all very ambiguous, just keeping a general eye on things, and tactical military data gathering, which is the kind of thing you do when you're planning an attack. The second is clearly illegitimate. The first, slightly less so. And I think in all of these ways, myself, that what one is seeing is a normal pattern of a great power with worldwide interest becoming slowly a sea power. But I think it's very steady. I think it's not dramatic. I think it's not necessarily agreed by the entire constituency of opinion in China, but nonetheless, I think it's happening.
Can the rest of the panel please comment on the first question or comment?
So I think Ola Thunander's question was about Sesankakis, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a general development from the US and Japan to increase attention.
Okay, perhaps lead you.
Undoubtedly, the big game in the region is the US-China relationship. And I think all these situations, other situations, South China Sea, East China Sea, have got to be judged in the context of the impact and the association with the bilateral relationship between the US and China. And that's why potentially the East China Sea is a more serious situation than the South China Sea. I mean, a fine example of that was Obama's recent visit to the region, where he made that assuring statement to the Japanese that the Senkakus were included. Now, that I think sort of led in some ways to the some of the language from the Chinese speakers in the recent Shangri-La dialogue, because China certainly sees the Senkaku, sees a dimension to the Senkakus, apart from the basic sovereignty issue, as in the context of the impact on the broader US-China relationship. That's why I think we can be much more optimistic about the situation in the South China Sea than the situation in the East China Sea, because the US factor is less. It's certainly at play there, but it's less in play in terms of likelihood of direct US involvement and all that sort of thing.
Yes, between Japan and China, there are two disputes. One is about maritime boundary, and there they have two different principles. China has the principle of the natural extension of the continental shelf, which goes all the way out to the Okinawa Trough, which is near the Ryukyu Islands. And that continental shelf will include also the area around the Senkaku Islands, unless they have rights of their own. Japan's argument is the median line principle. There is a huge overlap, and in that area there have been also an agreement for joint exploration in a certain period that fell apart in 2007. But there have been attempts at cooperation. The other dispute is over the Senkaku Islands, which is a group of 5 small islands or rocks that have never had human habitation. And they are nearer to Taiwan than to any Japanese or Chinese territory. So Taiwan may actually... No, that doesn't help Japan's claim, since this is land. But Taiwan has a claim on behalf of China, as a Republic of China. In 1978, I think it was, Deng Xiaoping visited Japan, and he said that this dispute over Senkaku is something we can leave to future generations. That was understood later by the Chinese as an agreement to that both sides could use the waters around it. And this was also done quite a lot. Fishermen from Taiwan, from mainland China, and from Japan could fish there without any interference. In 2010, there was Coast Guard ship from Japan that tried to expel fishermen from China who were inside the 12 nautical mile territorial sea of one of the Senkaku Islands. And one of those captains of the fishing boats, Chinese, may have been drunk, because he started to ram the Coast Guard ship repeatedly, and we saw it on video afterwards. He was taken under arrest, and this caused a big dispute between China and Japan, where Japan finally bowed to pressure from China and released the fishing boat captain without putting him on trial. The next dispute came in 2012, when the right-wing extremist mayor of Tokyo, Ishihara, threatened with buying up islands held by another private individual, and that would be seen as dangerous from the Japanese point of view, because that would the government would lose control of an issue that was difficult between itself and China. So the government then instead bought the islands to prevent this mayor from buying it. That was then seen as a nationalization and caused enormous protests from China, and a very serious incident. So you see that there have been nationalist tendencies on both sides, and changes in the behavior both on the Japanese and the Chinese side that are quite worrisome, and also linked to the naval build-up, which is happening both in Japan and China.
Okay, then we have the last 3 questions. The gentleman in the front here first. And please, due to time, I have short questions.
As always, very short questions. My thanks to the panel. My name is Wolfberg. I'm Minister of Foreign Affairs, retired. A question pertaining to naval and confidence and security building measures, or perhaps conference building measures, as Mr. Tønnesen referred to. Taking into consideration that, of course, the attention now is on the Chinese naval buildup and possible U.S. responses. And even if I totally agree that China is not looking to get into a shooting war with the United States, still incidents could arise because things happen. And on the pattern which we have in this part of the world, naval incidents agreement to avoid collisions and unwanted episodes. Now, taken into consideration, starting with the premise that both parties are interested in having these kind of agreements, is that the case? Do you read the situation the same way, that both parties are interested in having these kind of agreements? Then the question is precisely what would be the parameters of entering into such agreements? Which situations will it cover? Thank you.
And the final question from Indra today.
Thank you. My name is Indra Overland, and I work here at NUPI. I'll formulate this as a comment rather than a question in the hope of saving time. When I was an undergraduate, in my first year as an undergraduate, we were introduced to a theory of political science about negotiations. And the theory was that in a bilateral negotiation about whatever, you have two desired outcomes. One party wants this, the other party wants that. And the compromise, if there's a compromise, tends to be somewhere close to the middle. So, a logical strategy in negotiations is to move your claim further away, hoping to pull the compromise close to the middle. And we hear a lot about how kind of irreconcilable these positions in the South China Sea are, and how it's impossible and very dangerous, and the domestic audience and so on, which all makes a lot of sense. But I just wonder, is it, or no, it's not a question. It strikes me that perhaps another way of thinking about this is that, and the 9-dash line and the whole thing, is that the Chinese are moving their positions very far in order to perhaps compromise, maybe not in the near future, but at some point. And I'm also a little bit inspired by what's going on in Ukraine, where I see very much the same thing. The Russians want Crimea. They don't really want East Ukraine, but they're leaning on it so that they can let go on it and then make a nice compromise, they hope, on Crimea.
Okay, final remarks from the panel on those two questions and comments. We can start off with Bateman and go to the right.
If I understand correctly, the first question was really about Inc. Sea agreements. As I mentioned, we've got those that code for unalerted encounters between ships, which is non-binding and region-wide, and a fairly soft approach, I think, because the incident sea agreements we saw between the Soviet Union and other countries were binding type agreements. I don't think either China or US really want such an agreement. China and US, they do have had for 10 years or so their military maritime consultative arrangement talks, which is a forum in which they can talk about these issues. From China's point of view, China says that those Inc. Sea agreements were a Cold War issue. There's no Cold War between the US and China. That's what they say. So why do we need such an agreement? I don't think the US wants the agreement, because the US is always actually very chary about these agreements, because they can see them as being a slippery slope towards placing some form of constraint on US operations. A third reason why I don't think there'll be such an agreement is the business I was talking about during the presentation, exclusive economic zones. In what area will these agreements apply? Now, I understand that the code for unalerted, agreed code for unalerted encounters between ships is outside territorial waters, probably also gets around probably high seas, not the EEZ. So, getting into a real incident sea agreement between the China and the US would open up the EEZ differences between the two countries. On some just other issues, since I have the floor, talk about confidence building. Of course, I think Stein referred to the number of conferences and meetings we have around the region. Of course, instead of confidence building, we can have conference building, which of course is a very good initiative from the academic point of view.
That's exactly what it
and
is.
lastly, I'll take issue. I'm starting to use Stein's anecdote about the Japanese Coast Guard vessel being rammed by the fishing vessel. I use that as an example, in fact, as how the global commentary often beats up things and gets it wrong. When you look at that video, and there's probably some seafarers present here who know well that the collision regulations, international collision regulations, say that vessels should keep clear of vessels engaged in fishing operations. When you look at the video, the Chinese fishing boat was clearly fishing and was clearly being harassed by the Japanese Coast Guard vessel, which had made several passes very close, just 50 metres or so off the Chinese fishing vessel. So it's not an open and shut case of the Chinese fishing vessel ramming the Japanese patrol boat. The Japanese patrol boat was clearly harassing the Chinese fishing vessel while it was undertaking legitimate fishing issues.
I understand now that I must revisit YouTube and see that video again. I will just explain to Indra why your reasoning goes for some cases and not for the South China Sea as a whole. It's valid for the East China Sea, where you have the median line principle from the Japanese side and the natural prolongation of the continental shape principle from the Chinese side, because then you have a wide difference. And you could approach something in between through bilateral negotiations. It would probably be nearer to the median line than to the natural prolongation, because the median line principle is stronger in international law than the natural prolongation principle in this case. Of course, Chinese would not say that, but I think a negotiated result would reflect this. In the Tonkin Gulf, it's also valid because here China and Japan made arguments, and they negotiated a compromise which gave some right to the little island that Vietnam has in the middle of the sea, but much less than Vietnam will have claimed and could actually claim. So that was a negotiation. But the 9-dashed line cannot work, because negotiations about maritime boundaries must be made with the reference to international law. And the 9-dashed line has no basis in international law unless it's seen just as a claim to the islands inside it and their maritime zones. So what China must do is to make an excessive claim based on international law. It must say that all the islands are Chinese and they have arrived to 200 nautical mile zones, and then it must measure 200 nautical mile zones around them and use the median line principle between them and the nearest coast. Then it will have an excessive claim that can be the basis for negotiations. As long as it has just a 9-dashed line, there is no basis for any negotiation. That is just basis for the dangerous status quo.
Last words of the day, Jeffrey Till.
Yes, first of all, queues and all the rest of it. There is a problem in actually agreeing incidents at sea agreement in the area that Sam's already talked about. Which area does it apply? Because of what we've just been hearing about the South China Sea, those areas where incidents are most likely are the ones by definition where an agreement of any binding nature are the least likely, which is kind of counterfactual, but that happens. But it's not the only kind of confidence building measure that one can imagine. There's hotlines, for example, but there's a big difference between the hotline systems that have been negotiated and still are being negotiated in the region and actually making them a reality. On many occasions when incidents happen and people would pick up the phone, there's literally either nobody at the other end or there's nobody who's willing to actually enter into any kind of realistic discourse. There's a big difference between negotiating the principle, which looks good diplomatically, and actually making it work as a real way of calming down incidents at sea. Transparency, the idea of building confidence by trust and transparency. I mean, the standard aphorism is that the Americans tend to argue that transparency creates trust, and the Chinese response is that trust is necessary before you get transparency. Absolute classic of the chicken and egg sort of argument. And the problem is that you're talking about negotiations between two countries with entirely different concepts of what transparency means. As far as the United States is concerned, an awful lot of information about the US Navy is available on the internet. So if you like, the Americans aren't giving up anything when they agree to transparency measures, but the Chinese is not the same. So the incentives and the problems and the burdens are not equitable. I mean, that's the fundamental issue because of the nature of the regimes and the situations that they're in. And that seems to me to be a genuinely difficult issue. And going back to this issue about international law, the problem is that international law is a phrase widely used and people tend to think of it as being simply UNCLOS. It isn't. It's UNCLOS plus customary law. It's effectively what has already been agreed and agreed. And the problem is that UNCLOS, like most international treaty law, is a compromise. And with compromises comes ambiguity. And with ambiguity comes the possibility of genuinely different interpretations as to what was meant. And that's the reason why some maritime lawyers tend to argue that one day we ought to have another UNCLOS. But the prospect of going through all this again for the next 40 years is something that the rest of us just couldn't face.
Okay, thank you for those remarks. You mentioned YouTube. This seminar has been recorded and streamed live on the internet, but also the recording from this seminar will be available on YouTube. So later on, if you want to revisit some of the slides and some of the arguments, you can just go over the internet and look that up on the NUPI side on YouTube. All three of you, it's been a delight to listen to you, all three of you. There's such a positive experience to listen to people who have been working on these matters for decades and clearly know what they're talking about. It's always interesting to listen to the variances of opinion between the three of you. So, big hand of applause to all three of you, and especially to you, the two international guests at this seminar. Thank you.